Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the Carbon Leadership Forum's Embodied Carbon Network 2019 webinar series. My name is Kate Simonen. I'm Director of the Carbon Leadership Forum and a co-chair of the Embodied Carbon Network. This is the final session of a 6-part annual webinar series. We have several exciting speakers joining us today who will speak to a valuable initiative of the Canadian government. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available upon its completion. Many of you who are joining today are already members of the Embodied Carbon Network. We do have guests in the audience who we invite to learn more and to join the network. The Embodied Carbon Network is a communication and knowledge sharing platform that was launched by the Carbon Leadership Forum in January of 2017. It brings together professionals working in or within the building sector to share news, resources, engage in discussion, and to develop educational content. This is all organized around a shared goal that recognizes the need to phase out carbon emissions by 2050 and a focus on the impacts from building material manufacturing or embodied carbon. The network has evolved into a vibrant, engaged global community. To date, we have over 1,600 professionals from across the building sector, academia, nonprofit, and government groups, representing 200 cities and 33 countries across the world. We are brought together under this shared mission of eliminating embodied carbon from the built environment in order to meet global greenhouse gas emissions targets by 2050. The network is comprised of 10 subject-specific focus groups, which members can join for additional engagement around topics related to embodied carbon. This is a volunteer-led initiative, and so please let us know if you have ideas about how you can help us expand and scale our impact. The Embodied Carbon Network is funded and managed by the Carbon Leadership Forum. The Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington brings together a diverse cross-section of the building industry focused on radically reducing and ultimately eliminating embodied carbon. We conduct research, develop resources, and convene communities such as the Embodied Carbon Network, as well as incubate member-led initiatives to achieve these goals. Thank you so much to our sponsors for supporting the Embodied Carbon Network and this annual webinar series. Again, today's webinar is the final session of a 6-part series. Each topic is based off of a network focus group, and the focus group chairs have worked with their groups to identify speakers and develop the curriculum for each session. Our goal is that each session will not only be useful as live participants, but also serve as free educational resources for anyone interested in learning more. Please feel free to share webinar recordings with your colleagues, professional networks, and students. As a disclaimer, the mention of any trade names or commercial products does not constitute endorsement or recommendations for use. And please note that the opinions, ideas, products, or data presented by speakers in this session do not necessarily represent those of the members of the Embodied Carbon Network or the Carbon Leadership Forum or constitute endorsements. Our goal is to introduce topics that will help participants think and talk about building industry strategies for reducing embodied carbon that related to building materials. A few things to note before we kick off the presentations. The presentations will be followed by a 15 to 20-minute question and answer session. So please submit your questions through the Zoom chat function, and we will track and direct them to the appropriate speakers at the end of the session. If you're an AIA member and need educational credits, you can get credits for live attendance if you email to info@carbonleadershipforum.org your AIA member and your full name. And if you've missed any previous webinar sessions, please visit the Carbon Leadership Forum Embodied Carbon Network section on the website to access those recordings. And plan ahead for 2020. You can join us for the first all-network call on January 17th at 9 a.m. We'll have some overview and opportunities to connect and network with other network participants. So today we're joined by 3 great speakers. Jeremy Gregory. Jeremy Gregory is the research scientist at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the executive director of the Concrete Sustainability Hub at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is chair of the Embodied Carbon Network LCA Data and Tools focus group and has organized this webinar. I'm going to hand it over to him to introduce the other speakers. Thank you so much for your leadership in this area, Jeremy.
Great. Thanks very much, Kate. I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce our speakers today, and I'm going to be brief. As the chair of the LCA Data and Tools, a focus area within ECN, I really wanted this topic to be a big focus for us. Many of us in North America have been trying to improve the lifecycle inventory data that's been used and have been talking about various ways to do that. And what was great is that in the context of buildings and motivated by buildings, our neighbors to the north in Canada really stepped up and introduced this great initiative called Low Carbon Assets through LCA initiative. And so I really asked them if they could share it with the Embodied Carbon Network and others who are interested as a way of introducing the topic, but then also using it to think about how do we really turn this into something bigger that could perhaps be collaboration across multiple countries or even states and provinces, and turn it into something bigger. So we're really fortunate today to have the two leaders of this initiative. They're going to share what they've done, and our idea is to keep it not particularly long so that we have plenty of time for a question and answer period at the end. And so, as was mentioned at the beginning, if you do have questions throughout this, please go ahead and type them into the chat window, and then when the speakers are done presenting, we'll use that to go through our Q&A. So the two speakers, the first one is Jeff Guest, and he's a research officer at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa, where he's an expert in LCA and particularly related to infrastructure, buildings, and energy systems. And so he's one of the leaders on this effort. And the other speaker we have is Rob Cooney, and he's a project manager at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa. And there he supports the development and execution of complex multi-year projects. And this endeavor, as you'll find out, is definitely one of those. And so they're fortunate to have this tag team here leading the effort. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues there to give us the introduction. Please, Rob and Jeff, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to be able to share what we're doing with the greater network. So thank you very much for having us. I'm just going to try to share my presentation. And here we go. Hopefully Great. Everyone can see that, all right?
Yep, we can indeed see it.
Okay.
Take it away.
So thank you very much. Today, basically, we just want to walk everyone through what we're doing, like give you a brief overview, talk a little bit about our governance. The governance is a big part of this initiative. We're very multi-collaborational across Canada at the federal, provincial, territorial levels, but also with industry itself. We'll talk about our approach and what our initiative pillars are. The initiative pillars are big buckets of work that we're looking to get done, and our starting project plan of how we're tackling this. So one of the areas that I want to start talking about is very briefly what the Canadian government has put forward as commitments. So the government of Canada has subscribed to the Paris 2015 commitments, and this is where the concept was born out of. This project directly will help the federal government help achieve our commitments to the Paris 2015 targets. So who we've partnered with is, it's called Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, and they're essentially the department that controls the flow of money within our government departments. And they have a portion within that department called the Greening of Government. And the Greening of Government is a very niche area that helps connect experts within the federal government to identify ways that we can reach our targets. And they have 4 areas of interest: real property, fleet, procurement and clean technologies, and adaptation. And essentially, our initiative helps them meet targets in two areas, real property and procurement. And right now, our targets are to get a 40% reduction of emissions by 2030, an aspirational goal by 2025, and hopefully get an 80% target by 2050. So where we begin is the Treasury Board Secretariat and the National Research Council got together to talk about how do we get reduced life cycle carbon in our construction assets. And there was a large workshop that was held in Canada back in October 2018, where we brought together many different stakeholders to talk about this particular area. And there's 4 key pillars that would help us achieve these low carbon asset targets. The first and foremost, in the simplest form, something the NRC is very good at, is building technical infrastructure. And that would be the LCI, getting the LCI data, putting it in an LCA database, developing LCA guidelines to use, and making sure that those are supported with LCA tools. As the NRC looks to develop that, a number of things are going to fall out of that. Research, we're going to need to do research to help address gaps that we find in developing data or developing the database or guidelines. But it also resides on having us to have the ability to advocate for LCA in areas that it doesn't currently exist today. And that advocacy leads us right into market integration. It's fantastic if we can build the technical infrastructure. That's what we rely on. It's fantastic if we support that infrastructure with research and we're advocating, hey, everyone should use LCA. But if we're not doing it hand in hand with industry and experts in this area, then we're going to really miss the mark. And so we need to have market integration to help drive that commercial construction acceptance. So one of the main fundamental principles that we're working on is collaborating with industry, getting their direct feedback and input as we move this project and initiative along. And so that leads us to the last aspect, procurement. It's very nice to build the technical infrastructure built on research. It's even better to work with the construction associations and industry, but how do we get them to leverage all that? And that's procurement. We view the Canadian government views procurement as the central point to bring this all together. It's a way to incent industry to use these tools that they helped co-develop. So that leads us very simply, what are we trying to do with the life cycle, low carbon assets through life cycle assessment, otherwise known as LCA squared initiative? And I'm going to read this verbatim. We want to develop and enable a Canadian regional, provincial, specific life cycle inventory database and guidelines and associated LCA guidelines to enable the public sector, private sector portfolio holders to incorporate the quantification of life cycle carbon and total cost of ownership of built assets into the procurement processes. Simply, we want to be able to quantify embodied carbon and put that into procurement processes, which enables builders, owners to have informed decisions about the impacts of carbon to the projects that they are building. Very simply, the conceptual overview of that vision statement is this. Starting at the left, we have that center procurement. We have that starting point of procurement. In procurement, we're going to set RFP specifications. They're going to review proposals. They're going to select the bids. But how? They're going to receive bids from our users. These are the project builders, architects, engineers, LCA practitioners. They're getting results from LCA tools, but most of all, those tools hopefully are leveraging the database, the regionally specific Canadian database that we're putting together. And all that is founded on the guidelines that we're developing. And so we want to provide procurement guidance. We're going to provide whole building LCA guidelines, whole building LCCA guidelines, and help set specific criteria for whole building LCA tools. And that is all layered in research, helping to address some of the fundamental questions that comes up through our project, helping to address those gaps. very simply, here are our objectives. So we're spearheading a consortium over the next 4 years that will direct and fund over $7 million of projects to establish that Canadian LCI database, to develop high quality LCA data sets that are transparent, establish the guidelines for LCA, look to integrate environmental product declarations. And to be able to do those top 4 items, there's a number of things that we have to do in parallel with that. And we need to conduct some pilot projects. And the pilot projects are help to inform us that the guidelines that we've developed, that the tools that we're working with are in fact practical and able to be easily used by industry. And as we do that, we're going to need to be able to talk to the greater community to help develop a suite of communication products about this initiative. And so that could be simply a website that tells us what we're doing, and more advanced user interaction, like webinars like this, workshops spread across the country. We have a large number of provincial stakeholders. We're already fielding questions and requests from them to come to their locations to talk about what we're doing, which leads us to the governance structure. And so this is I view this as the heart of the initiative, outside of that general science. But this is making sure that we have the right people at the table, helping to set the vision and expectations, and that's that steering committee. And on that steering committee, we have government, industry, academia, NGOs, and it is a very balanced diversity of holders at that steering committee level. They're helping us to understand where does this initiative want to be, and how do we get there is really the function of the technical committee. And our technical committee is really diverse. We have some really strong LCA experts from across Canada, the US, contributing their expertise to this. And they're the group that's helping to develop the strategies to reach the vision. And below that, we have the project teams and task groups. These are the very detailed oriented individuals that are doing the actual work that was set out. And all that's kind of kept together by the secretariat. Secretariat is the connection, the facilitator, the group that's helping to make sure everything's on track and moving forward. So what's our approach for doing this? Well, this is a very simple diagram. Basically, we're starting at the LCI data and database level. We're going to build on the existing standards and protocols that are out there. And from that, we'll build the guidelines. We'll help enable the tools to fit within those guidelines. We'll evaluate EPDs. And once we have that infrastructure in place, that will allow procurement policy and specifications to come out of that. It'll inform us how we set benchmarks and targets, with the ultimate goal of enabling that low carbon procurement. Although we're starting with whole buildings, that's our focus, we anticipate what we're attempting to do with this initiative will be replicatable across other industries and can be expanded to other infrastructure typologies, could go to mining, automotive, and so on. So what are our project tasks? So to kick this off for this year, this is our foundational year. This is where we're starting to drive our roadmap of how do we achieve these things. And we saw that there was 3 fundamental things that we needed to begin with. Very simply, we need to have that LCI database and the associated data sets started to develop a roadmap of what do we need to acquire, where is it, what the gaps are, and how do we address any gaps that we find. And so we're working very closely with the industry associations. They have been very kind to let us see under the hood of some of their areas that they have. They have access to data that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. and they're proving to be very reliable partners in this initiative. As that gets kicked off, we've also kicked off putting together a whole building LCA guidelines. We're looking to have a draft developed by the end of this March, which is the end of the Canadian fiscal year, which will help provide that roadmap for where do we need to tighten up, what are some fundamental research questions that we have to answer to make sure that guideline is as strong as possible. And at the same time, again, that procurement aspect is the anchor. And so we started off very simply looking at Public Services and Procurement of Canada, PSPC. This is the organization within Canada that buys everything for the federal government. And so we started with them to understand what their processes are for acquiring new buildings. And we worked very hard to identify where the integration points are. And we wanted to have an initial focus on material-specific LCA. In particular, working with industry, we've highlighted that cement concrete is a great place to start of easy, quick wins for us. So is there a way that we can work with the largest procurement agency in Canada to help identify low carbon cement concrete projects? And that's really what we're setting to accomplish this year. We're well underway. We have some really good initial progress, and we hope to maintain it as we move along. The next part of the presentation that we have is really talking about the initiative pillars. And this is where my colleague, Jeff Guest, who is the technical architect behind this, will help walk you through that. So I'll let Jeff take it over right now.
Great, thank you, Rob. So yeah, in terms of the initiative, we decided upon these 9 project pillars as the main buckets of projects to get underway. Of course, there's a lot of overlap between pillars. It's not in isolation. So these are some of the major connection points between them, as you can see here. And so also, it's just, I could just mention sustainable business model is sort of the concept here is that we want to figure out how to sustain this initiative for more than the 4-year project period. So how can we continue? How can we secure funding for the longer term? So I'm just going to touch through each pillar really quickly, starting with LCA Data Sets. So our main priority is structural building materials, and then also envelope materials and key finishing materials. So our first focus is largely on buildings, and right now we're underway in understanding what's currently available in existing databases from around North America. And even beyond that aren't currently integrated in the database that we're looking to utilize, which is EcoInvent. And so once we get that sort of list of what's available in terms of what exists, and then figuring out where the key gaps are, we're going to start prioritizing data set development. And actually, we're also underway. We're already starting to develop some data sets now as well. So as part of the technical committee, we decided that the EcoInvent database would be the best background database to integrate our data sets with, just because it's quite popular globally. It's very transparent and generally of high quality. But I think one of the major deciding points was that it's a very transparent database that allows you to look at data sets at a gate-to-gate level, and this was popular amongst all of our stakeholders. So this is where our data sets will sort of reside. But we, as you know, if you develop a data set, you still retain the ownership of it. So we can provide full transparency of the data sets we develop to allow people to see, you could say, unlinked inputs and outputs, which gives people a better understanding of what's actually going into these data sets. Like Rob said, we're currently developing research ideas right now. We actually have our first technical committee meeting next week on this pillar of LCA research, where We're going to come together and discuss ways of leveraging funding through academic grants, so we can get the most out of this pillar. And then we're going to prioritize research ideas through the technical committee. Right now, as Rob mentioned, we're already working on some projects to write a draft guideline for whole building LCA. We're also right now undertaking the development of a sort of an extended outline for a life cycle cost assessment guideline as well. And we're not trying to reinvent any wheels here. We're just trying to look to where we can fill some key gaps in guidance and try to have a more fulsome document on performing whole building LCA and LCCA. And then when it comes to tools, we want the tools that we're going to be using for making procurement decisions to adopt the data sets that we're developing and to adopt the guidance that we're providing in the guidelines. So we're working with we will be working with tool providers to meet a certain criteria that we're going to develop over time through the technical committee, and to ensure that they're utilizing the data sets we're actually developing. And yeah, obviously EPD integration is important. So I've talked about data set development. This is really about the industry regional average data sets that go into a large database like EcoInvent that we're utilizing. But what about EPDs? Like, obviously there's a lot of EPDs out there as well, and they have their merit when you're doing whole building LCA. So we want to look how can we integrate EPDs into whole building LCA, while addressing key comparability issues and ensuring that comparability is performed. The comparability is merited based on the EPDs that are going into a database. So this is a big discussion point that we're going to need to have with the technical committee. And actually, our first meeting on EPD integration is in the new year, January 7th, I believe, or no, January 9th. And then implementation and deployment, like Rob was saying, this is just about bringing things together so that we get a high adoption rate, essentially. Then lastly, procurement. This is where we utilize, so we're actually taking two broad approaches. One is what we call a material specific approach, where we're only looking at benchmarks and targets of specific materials like concrete and steel. And then the other approach is a more holistic approach, where you actually require whole building LCA and LCCA to help inform decisions in real property investment. So what we thought was it's best to start with a material specific approach, because we think it's a little bit easier to implement and we could probably get some quicker wins, but in a way they work in tandem. So we're striving to achieve both at the same time. And right now we're working on developing procurement specs for concrete in federal real property investment projects. So with all that said, we have a technical committee that talks about all these sort of topics. So to date, we've had 12 meetings that touched on a number of these pillars. We haven't touched on all of them yet, but we're getting there. And the whole idea is that we bring a series of experts in LCA, in procurement, in industry together, and we can discuss through and make key decisions on the way to scope projects and on the way to implement various aspects of this project. And so we've had some very fruitful discussions and presentations from various experts and across Canada and the US. And in fact, Jeremy Gregory and Kate Simon are on our committee and have given some very valuable input along the way. And so, yeah, the idea is that we like it when we invite various experts to share presentations, share their knowledge with the rest of the group. It enriches our discussions. And then generally we have a post-meeting survey where we'll try to drive a consensus on key topics where we need to achieve that. And so sort of the idea of this consensus-driven approach, it looks something like this. So we have a meeting on a given topic. So the idea is to inform, get everyone on the same page, present the salient points, we discuss the main challenges, the scope of work, and the whole idea is that we have a call to action to seek a consensus on a key matter, whether it be a methodology or a scope of data set development, whatever. It could be anything really. And then we disseminate those meeting minutes and slide deck, and we tend to usually follow up with a post-meeting survey, because an anonymized survey is a nice way to gather opinions quickly and synthesize it in a nice way. And so we do that, and then we basically ask the question, have we reached a consensus on a key matter? If we have, that's great. Then we tend to write a decision brief on that matter and say our technical committee has agreed that we should use the EcoInvent database to integrate data sets with, and then we go on. If we haven't reached a consensus, then we bring the matter up again in a later meeting with the knowledge that we've learned, and again we try to touch on the key issues and do the cycle again, and hopefully we lead to that consensus. So it's kind of motivated by the Delphi technique, you could say. This is what we've been employing. So that's about it from our side in terms of giving you that broad overview of the technical committee, or sorry, of the initiative on its whole. So now I think it's a good time to kind of open it up to Q&A. And some key points that we noted down are, we would love it if you would be interested in participating in our technical committee. You could send one of us an email, and we can send you an invitation. We thought this would be another key area, win-win data set development opportunities, where we can take existing data sets in, say, the data commons in the US and integrate them with EcoInvent where possible, where right away where data sets make sense for both Canada, or maybe from a North American context in general. And then, yeah, we want to further this discussion of how we can expand this initiative beyond focus of Canada, but like developing a harmonized approach to an LCI database for North America. So with that, I'll pass it back to Rob or Jeremy to go to try to motivate, prime some questions, or we can just have some Q&A of the initiative.
We got lots of questions, so we'll dive right into those. Thanks very much for the overview. And as I said, we intentionally set this up so we'd have lots of time for discussion. I'd say the first one, there's already some folks saying, how can I get involved with this? And as you mentioned, technical committee participation. So maybe just a logistics thing. Should they contact Rob to get added to your list, or how would that work?
Yeah, it would be best to contact me.
Okay. Jeff. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, and my email address is.
How about I'll put it in the. Oh, there you go. Good. I was going to say I'll put it in the chat window as well.
Oh, sure.
Good.
Yeah, if you do that, I can stay on the other side.
Why don't you just leave it up here for a little bit, and then we'll also add it in the chat window. So, okay, great. So that's answer to one question. Another kind of broader one is, how could another government, such as a U.S. state or federal agency, or we've talked with folks in Mexico as well, engage in this process? Would you recommend a parallel initiative or one that's combined?
So it's Rob here, and okay. I would say, first, we want to have that open discussion from both sides to understand if we have similar goals. I think having a parallel initiative would be good, but I think the ultimate goal would be to have a nice integrated or combined approach that could be a little ways off to understanding what that looks like, but we have to start somewhere. And so if there are any federal departments or other agencies that would like to speak to us, feel free to reach out to us. Probably also a good opportunity right now is to introduce Jonathan Martin, who's also on the call. Jonathan Martin is the overall program lead for this initiative here at the NRC. And he's looking at other very interesting aspects of how do you enable a low carbon economy in Canada, And so we would welcome any discussions along the lines of further LCA development.
Great. So I think it sounds like the short answer is let's talk some more, right?
Yes.
You and I have already talked about trying to engage some of the federal agencies, and they know about that, and we'll be following up with them, at least in the U.S., and a few state ones as well. But if we've missed anyone, once again, just get in touch with Jeff and Rob here, and we can set up some discussion. So.
Yeah, and at the very minimum, like the majority of our outputs from this initiative, we intend to make publicly available to adopt, which is very much part of our operating strategy. So we have a lot of Canadian provinces participating with us, and so our deliverables are meant to go directly to them. And so anything that we develop that could be taken and improved on or adapted to another jurisdiction, we'd be incredibly pleased if that was an outcome.
Great, good.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple other questions about verification, like whether it's about EPD data or essentially like who is the program operator for verifying LCAs and EPDs. And so can you talk a little bit about if you've had, I realize probably none of that's decided yet, but how have some of the discussions gone so far as verification and program operators?
Yeah, so the whole topic of EPD integration we haven't dealt with yet, but we will probably, that would be a great question for our meeting in January, which if you want to be involved, let us know. But I mean, generally speaking, I don't have any, we haven't really decided, and I don't know if it really matters. I guess, of course, we want to make sure we follow the same product category rule, but in terms of the program operator who registers the EPD, in my personal opinion, it doesn't matter that much. When it comes to third-party verification of data sets, that's going to be something that we're working in lockstep with EcoInvent on when it comes to developing the industry average, but that's a different matter. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have any insight there.
No, I think just as you said, it's TBD, but that's part of the discussion. And as Jeff said, as someone who's participated in some of these discussions about technical committee, it's impressive to see how much of that process in place. Really, they're open to a lot of feedback, and will ultimately taking that into account when they are making decisions. So. Okay. Or sorry, did you want to add anything else to that? Or?
Well, yeah, I just think the whole topic of EPDs is a very sensitive one, I think, to a lot of people. So it's one that I'm sure we'll have a number of meetings on. Yeah.
And I think what you're already differentiating, as you showed in one of your slides, sort of design decisions as compared to procurement decisions. And so where EPDs come into play will be different depending on which decisions you're talking about. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Most notably, we think we can readily use EPDs for material specific choices. That there's not really a huge problem there, but of course we want to. In Canada, we're a little behind in terms of developing facility-specific EPDs. I think that's the next stage that we're trying to drive forward. Great.
Okay. There's a question about you have talked about buildings here and alluded a little bit to infrastructure as well. And so could you talk about a decision about focusing on buildings first instead of pavements, which is usually sort of a government, really a government-controlled thing. So maybe you could talk through how those discussions went, or whether pavements are still part of this as well.
So it's Rob Cooney here. One of the main driving reasons why we're evaluating buildings first is because the federal government did a scan, and that is one of their major things that the actual federal government purchases right away. Yes, pavements and roadways, but generally they're purchased provincially, not federally. And so we focused on one of the Government of Canada's main hotspots. That's really how it came to be.
Got it. Okay, great. There is some questions about the collaboration with EcoInvent. Could you talk a bit more about how those discussions have been going, and then sort of building off of that, if you have new LCI data that's identified to fill those gaps, what's the process by which you envision being able to fill that, and then how does it then integrate into EcoInvent?
Okay. So I'll start off to talk a little bit about the high level stuff, and I'll leave it to my colleague Jeff to fill in the gaps that I don't quite get well enough or explain well enough. So one of the things that we were very fortunate to have was the province of Quebec back in 2015, they attempted to create their own provincial specific LCI database. And they had initially partnered with EcoInvent. And so it set a really good precedent and opportunity for us. They worked, the provincial government worked very closely with École Polytechnique out of Montreal, a consultancy, academic consultancy called SUREG, and they did an incredibly good job at laying the foundational work of how do you stand up a operational LCI database that's provincially specific, and they they built some very strong collaborative relationships with EcoInvent, and so we very simply leveraged off a lot of their success and connected early on with EcoInvent themselves, started those early conversations of what it would look like and what it would take. And EcoInvent, as you may or may not know, is a not-for-profit. It was born out of Switzerland on a very similar venture. And they were very open to working with us, as they've done with other countries, to create a national and regional specific database. And so that's really why and how it came to be. Our conversations with them to date have been very fruitful. They're very open to collaboration with us. We don't have a formal agreement at this time, but we do have some agreements in principle, and we're looking to develop that further into the new year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're trying to follow suit with the agreement that the SUREG developed with EcoInvent in terms of allowing to share their data sets. We want to be able to share data sets so that tools can use them, and also maybe publicly accessible wrapped up results. That's something that we're hoping to achieve in the coming months. And then in terms of priority, in terms of filling gaps, like I said earlier, we are developing an extensive list of data sets that we want to develop, and that list of data sets we're going to have a sort of priority to, and that will kind of govern what data sets we develop and integrate with EcoInvent. And so a number of those data sets could be already existing data sets that are out there but not integrated, and that's where we're going to build from. So that sort of master list that we're getting done, we're working with SUREG on, should be ready in later March, and from there we'll pivot toward prioritizing those data sets to develop.
Great. All right. There's a question about the guidelines and other deliverables. Will they be open source? And I think you can interpret that how you want in terms of what other deliverables are being talked about. So maybe you could differentiate guidelines from the data that will be in EcoInvent and talk about the degree to which those will be open source.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, of course, the guideline, everything, most deliverables are going to be freely, openly available on our website, like the guidelines, for example. Mm-hmm. When it comes to data sets, yes, this is sort of the same way you see them in EcoInvent. You're going to have that level of transparency. Of course, we need to hedge against breach of confidentiality. So that's just a matter of horizontal averaging data sets for when we get survey data from key industries. But other than that, everything's going to be fairly transparent and accessible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And have you decided if the whole building LCA would be cradle to gate or cradle to grave? Or it could be maybe you just differentiate it. Is it just embodied, or would it include operational?
Yeah. So when we're taking that holistic approach rather than the material specific, we are striving for that holistic whole building cradle to grave LCA. approach. So we are going to be getting into those topics of end of life scenarios, service life of various elements in a building, etc. And a lot of that's going to be tackled in the whole building LCA guidelines.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just it seems like because whole building LCA can include end of life, like whole building LCA and LEED includes end of life, but it's just embodied. And so it sounds like what you're saying, the only term I've heard is whole building and whole life LCA, which does include operational, and you're saying it would include operational.
Yeah, I think ideally we want to see operational, because I mean that's one of the government's goals, is to reduce not just the embodied but the operational performance as well. So it's important for us to quantify that. So.
Okay, great. All right. There's a question about the pilot projects. Could you talk a little bit more about sort of what you envision for those?
For the pilot projects, where we're starting right now is within procurement. And so we have a really strong procurement working group. Our working group is comprised of an expert from the Treasury Board Secretariat, as well as an internal expert from PSPC, the large purchasing agency for Canada. And what we're doing is we're doing internal scans at the national level, in the national region, and one of the provincial areas. And we're trying to select a pilot that is of sufficient size in the early design stage, so we can get the requirements in, and then we'll work with their designers and project architects and engineers to walk through our process. And so right now, the initial focus is on proving our proof of concept for procurement with the material specific approach. Once we complete that, we'll move on to the other areas.
Okay, great. There's a question here about differentiating between free versus open source. And the distinction here is that will the publications or guidelines be published using something like a Creative Commons copyright, so that another government organization could adapt and modify them in addition to just using them? So you could have something that's free, but maybe it's harder to actually, specifically take and adapt depending on what the copyright language is.
I think we both Rob and I are all for Creative Commons. If we can get our bosses to agree to that.
Yeah. So we're very commonly aligned on that. But keep in mind, we are a government initiative, and we need to work within the boundaries that we have, and we don't have the end say in how it gets released.
Sure. Yeah, but at least that's the direction in which you're headed.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So there's also a question about trying to understand decisions about locally produced versus imported materials. In particular, looking at transportation emissions and stuff like that. Can you talk a bit about how you envision those types of decisions being handled in here in terms of like tracking transportation distances and things like that?
Yeah, that's a tough question, one that we will probably struggle with, but I think a lot of the logistics that are required to get goods from one place to another can be covered in market mix activities within EcoInvent, but still there's a lot of limitation to that. I think it's easier to think about it when you have a facility specific EPD, because then you have a point address where a product is actually being produced. So when you're using EPDs, I think it's easier to wrap the mind around it. And from that point of view, we want to strive to develop something of a logistics algorithm to handle like a multimodal transportation calculator. I think that could be fairly achievable. Something I've been talking a little bit to with Phil Northcott of Sea Change Labs, and they've been discussing the implementation of sort of a distance calculator as well for EPDs. So that's one way of handling it. But when it comes to EcoInvent and the more average data sets. You have a market for something in a specific region. They have their own sort of assumptions on transport requirements. We'll investigate that to see whether we think it's robust enough, and then we may need to develop some adaptations to it in terms of actually applying it in the whole building LCA tool for decision making. But yeah, that's all. I don't know. That's pretty much all I can say about that right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems reasonable. There's some a bit more discussion about, or questions about, how the LCI data will be updated or edited, and so sort of some questions about specifically like the eco editor within eco invent, but maybe just the kind of the more broad question is, have you talked much about the process by which there's sort of a quality control on inventory data? Is it that someone comes to you and says, or you say, in order for it to be implemented in our database, it needs to have this format or that format, or people kind of give you what they have? Like I said, I realize you don't have definitive answers on any of these things, but can you give us a sense of some of the discussions you've had about how that might work?
Sure, yeah. So basically, the data sets are going to be developed through EcoInvent's submission processes, and actually now they have another submission approach. They've developed an online app that allows you to develop data sets in a sort of a spreadsheet format, where first you can copy an activity from Eco Editor, and it'll basically export it into like a spreadsheet format where you can fill in the metadata items and the inputs and outputs, etc. And then you can submit it through their online app, and it'll say whether it meets all of the requirements, or if there's an error, it'll tell you exactly where the error is, and then you can update it. So that's readily available. Anyone can sign up for that and start submitting data that way. We're actually going to have a technical committee meeting on that later January to discuss that whole process. That'll be led by Pascal Lesage from Zurich. So in terms of the verification and updating, it's fairly easy to update a data set. Like if you want to change a few numbers in an existing data set, you just do that and then submit it again. And then of course it goes through a third-party verification process, which will be led likely by EcoInvent. But we could have some say probably in who can be the pool of verifiers. Yeah, so.
Great. Okay.
Yeah,
that'll be an important process. So.
Yeah.
Okay. There's also a question about what tools and software programs are available at the moment for people to use, and I think at least we can start by saying there's nothing right now that's available because you're starting this process, but maybe that kind of in the last few minutes that we have, we talk a little bit about what's some of the timing that you expect with some of this process.
In terms of the tools, we're just starting to get into this right now. There's a number of tools that are available. There's some really good locally produced Canadian tools that are of high quality. We don't have an exact vision at this time, but we are working with some individuals on defining what that process is. I'd like to give you a little bit more, but it's still in development.
Sure. It just depends on what the scope is you decide to do, and that will then dictate the timing.
Absolutely. And so really it's about categorizing what are the key attributes that we want from the tools, and how do we ensure that the tools meet those. And I think there's a number of tools on the market, like in the Canadian market, that exist that have a lot of really good functionality. And so it's truly a matter of working through the initiative and our committees to make sure that we have a common understanding and agreement to that.
Great. Good. All right. Well, we've gone through our questions. We're in the last few minutes here. So I think just to wrap up, first of all, I really want to thank Jeff and Rob for taking the time to share this with the Embodied Carbon Network. I think, as everyone can see, we have a lot of opportunity here, and it's great to see the data and the processes that many of us talk about really being, have this potential to then support some really significant decisions at the government level. And I hope that everyone also sees the potential that I see for collaboration here. So it sounds like in the short term, if you want to be more involved in the technical committee discussions, which as I mentioned earlier, are really an interesting and exciting process, then please be in touch with Jeff and Rob about getting added to their mailing list and maybe indicating which technical committees that you want to be involved in. And then also, if you're from some kind of government agency, whether it be federal or state, in any in the U.S., Mexico, whatever, then please also get in touch with them, and I'd be glad to help with that as well, because there could be some ways that we try and use this effort to expand into something that works for many people jointly. And as Jeff and Rob said, they're very open to talking about what that collaboration might be, because right now there's nothing specifically formed about how that would work. So with that, I think that's the end of it. Thanks very much, everyone, and make sure that you register for more Embodied Carbon Network webinars, and you can also look for the recording on the ECN website to share with others who may have missed it. So, all right, with that, I think we'll end. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you all.